Check. Oh, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog. I'm Andy Kennedy, and the fact that there, for some reason, was no intro this morning is representative of my brain. 15 hours after getting my COVID vaccination. So my responses will be slightly delayed. So just so you know. We've got a massive show for you today, and I will begin it by introducing my lovely and talented co-host, Miss Carrie Barber. Good morning, Carrie.
Good morning, Andy. Yeah, I'm so sorry that you're not feeling the best, but we'll get through it together. Yeah, I felt the same when I had my first and second. So we all go through it, have slightly different reactions to it. So it's okay. It's all right. We're all with you, Andy. Everybody loves Andy, so it's fine.
All right, let's move on now.
Okay, all right, no problem. So there are a couple things that I wanted to talk about real quick before we get into our very important conversation. And this is something that we've touched on before. So for those of you who did not know, the Associated Press recently fired a good reporter named Emily Wilder, Wilder, and she had put out some information and has done some interviews where she said she really didn't get an understanding of why she was fired, but they cited their social media policy in reference to some tweets and some posts that she had done in her college days not too long ago that were about human rights advocacy, in particular in the Palestinian question. So the AP fired her over that because Tom Cotton and a bunch of alt-right folks on the right went after the AP saying that they should fire her. So this was the cancel culture that the right rails against, but they're using it, right? So it's the same tactic that we've seen them do before, where they say the sky is not blue, and then when you agree with them, they go, see, they don't know. So it's none of it is a genuine critique. It is all meant to cancel opinions and people who don't side with them. It's also an interesting critique of this argument about anti-Semitism for any type of advocacy for human beings. If you have we don't want to call it a conflict, that's not correct. When you have a massive force going into an open air prison, this is the Israeli forces going into Palestine, it is not anti-Semitic to call that out and to say, hey, people are dying. These are children, moms, dads, apartments, all of these things. That is not anti-Semitic. In fact, I have personally forwarded the argument that it is the Zionists who are anti-Semitic because they are operating against their own faith that they are trying to shield themselves with. So this goes back to the report that we did on the Hamas excuse in this entire scenario, as well as the report that we did on the CWA News Guild and why journalists should actually be unionizing within their respective employments, whether it's independent or you're part of, AP, Reuters, whatever. The News Guild is available, and their contracts can and do include clauses where you cannot be terminated for your social media posts, or in this case, advocacy for human rights. So I put a link to our show on the union segment where we interviewed two organizing members of CWA. And then also I wanted to give a shout out to the Rational.
Oh no! What the hell? What now? What? 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 You there, Carrie? Fadhel, can you hear me? Okay, so we lost Carrie somehow. Uh, Not sure what happened. Hopefully, Carrie will be back soon. Do you want to unmute there, Fadhel? I guess I'll take it from here.
It happens.
Oh my goodness. Well, anyways, we let's just continue. And of course, I'd like to welcome my good friend and our special guest, Fadhel Kaboub, professor who works at in Ohio, and he has graciously joined us this morning to talk about the current job numbers and what's happening and what's being reported and situations in the with those numbers and what is happening, especially what I would call the gig economy and the food services industry in general, as we see that there's a lot of currently a lot of places in the United States, like the larger corporations, the fast food chains, that are posting help wanted signs, and they can't get any help. And the reason is because people are making more money on unemployment than they would if they went back to work, and exposing themselves to COVID and all of that stuff. So good morning, Fadhel.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Not a problem. So in lieu of Carrie dropping off and not being here right now, why don't we just get right into it? And
Sure.
We've talked about, at length about what we, with our progressive policies on the MMT side with the job guarantee, quite a bit actually, and what that would mean for the economy is setting a baseline for a price. It's a very interesting dynamic right now with people being able to make more money staying at home instead of getting paid these horrible wages in jobs that are essential but not worth paying more than minimum wage.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this COVID crisis has at least brought that conversation to the national stage, that those wages are way too low for what it takes to have a decent quality of life in the U.S. And that kind of validates the Fight for 15 campaign and the Raise the Minimum Wage campaigns across the country. But first, let's start with maybe some basic definitions so that people are clear in terms of how the government, calculates these numbers for unemployment and who's in the labor force, who's not in the labor force, because there's usually a lot of confusion around that. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the department, the bureau, I guess, within the Department of Labor, that does the unemployment surveys and actually produces the official unemployment data for us. They do a monthly survey. So you don't do a census, obviously, every month to figure out who's working, who's not working. But it's a pretty rigorous method that they use to sample the population in a way that captures all the different facets of American society by race, gender, ethnicity, age groups, and geographic locations, rural and urban, large cities and small towns. And they essentially do this phone survey, and they ask the adult on the other side of the phone line a set of questions to determine whether they're working, whether they're in the labor force, not in the labor force. And then if they're not in the labor force, they even ask them about reasons why they dropped out of the labor force. And they produce all the data for us. It's available. They don't hide any of the information. It's just the media often doesn't report on the details and the nuances of the labor market. So the key question that they ask is, have you been working for the last 4 weeks? Because it's a monthly survey. And if you say yes, then you're in the labor force and you're counted as employed, obviously. But if you say no, then comes the key question of the survey, which is, have you been actively seeking work? ASW is the acronym for this. Actively seeking work, meaning you've turned in resumes, you've done job interviews, you've gone to employment agencies, you've done everything you can, and you have to demonstrate that. They follow up with a series of questions to assess whether you're really, really actively seeking work, or whether you just talked to a neighbor who talked to a cousin who said maybe they know somebody who has a job for you. So they really push on that question. And if your answer is yes, then you're in the labor force and you're counted as unemployed. So that's where the official unemployment statistics come from. But if you're for whatever reason they determine that you haven't been actively seeking work, then you're not in the labor force. You're not counted as unemployed. I'll give you a few examples of people who were excluded, systematically excluded from the survey.
Okay.
So first of all, we have kind of an in-between category, people who are working part-time, not because they wanted to, but because there is nothing else available for them. So they call it employed part-time for economic reasons. Those individuals are counted as working, and they're counted as in the labor force. So those numbers could be anywhere between 3 to 10 million people, depending on the economic situation, who are counted as working full-time, even though they may be working just a few hours a week, which means they're not really able to make a living. So that's one of the problems. The BLS is very transparent. They tell us exactly how many millions of people have been counted in that category every month. So they don't hide it. The media just doesn't report on it systematically. But the categories that are completely excluded from the labor force are people who lost their job or couldn't be in the labor force because the job doesn't pay enough for them to have somebody take care of their kids at home or elderly parents at home. So those individuals, even though they have the skills, they qualify for the job, in many cases they actually apply and get the job, but then they realize this doesn't add up, right? You're spending so much money on childcare or elderly care that you can't even spare any money for food, and then you lose your social benefits, your subsidized rent, you lose your food stamps or whatever other social benefits you have. So it makes perfect sense for those individuals to stay home, take care of their elderly family members or children, not work, and as a result be counted as out of the labor force because you're no longer actively seeking work. You just give up on the system. So those individuals are not counted. That kind of parallels the situation we're having right now, which is people opting for the benefits that the government is offering, the $15 an hour, rather than actually, working for less than $15 an hour. It doesn't add up. Why would you do it, right? Another category that is often, excuse me,
Go ahead.
another category of workers that are often excluded from the unemployment statistics, but the BLS will tell us exactly how many people are in that category, are people who, especially in the Midwest and rural areas, who don't have adequate transportation. So they may have the skills, they apply for the job, they get the job. In many cases, they may even start the job. But then eventually, because they can't get there on time, they don't have their own car, the job doesn't pay well enough, there's no public transportation, they end up losing the job because of lack of adequate transportation. Those individuals are also excluded from the unemployment statistics because now they're no longer in the labor force and they're not unemployed. So I can go on with a long list of workers, including workers on strike. They're technically not working, looking for work, but they're not working. But the BLS counts them as they've opted out of the labor force. They're no longer unemployed. People who lose their workplace because of a natural disaster. If they're waiting for the company to rebuild or the insurance company to reimburse them or whatever, they're not in the labor force. They're not actively seeking work. So those numbers start to add up for how many people are systematically excluded from the labor force. So that's very important for our friends to recognize that pre-COVID, the unemployment statistics provided by the BLS are actually pretty good, pretty accurate, and give us a really nuanced view of the labor market. But the media, the economics profession, the way we talk about it, we completely ignore all of those categories. And those are the individuals that become invisible from a public discourse perspective and systematically excluded from policy solutions and so on. So the COVID crisis, one of the silver linings is that people are paying attention to these nuances, that it doesn't make sense for an abusive employment system that underpays people systematically now to come back and say, well, they don't want to work for those miserable wages because the government is giving them a better option and healthier option given the COVID crisis.
Right,
But we need to
right.
broaden this conversation beyond just the COVID crisis and recognize that there's something fundamentally wrong with a system that automatically underpays and abuses millions of people in the system and excludes millions more because of what I described earlier.
Right, right. Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome back my co-host, Carrie. Have you worked out your technical issues?
I think so for the moment, totally outside of my control, but I kept thinking it's not Monday. What happened? So my apologies. I have missed part of the conversation. So,
well, I hope you don't mind that we started without you.
Not at all. This is way too important, and we appreciate
Well, and just a quick side note, if you don't recall, on Monday, my computer stopped functioning. It completely shut down, and I left Carrie, dangling in the wind per se.
Right.
And the first thing I thought of was when you dropped off was, payback's a bitch.
Well, I just got to admit that everybody who was watching was egging me on. They're like, Andy's not here to stop you. Just do the things. So, and I didn't. I did not. So, all right. So I missed a lot, and I don't know if you guys got to the big question that I had.
Well, we didn't. You were going to talk about numbers. So why don't you do that? And then we'll just take it from there.
Okay, so for those who are watching, thank you for your patience. I did put a link to the April jobs report, and when this came out, it was a really big deal. And there was some data in there that I thought was pretty telling. So, Fadhel, I know that it's not in front of you, so I'm just going to read one of the points that I thought was pretty telling. So they were talking about the part-time jobs that people were taking less than full employment. And the numbers that they posted were part-time for economic reasons, that people were taking these part-time jobs, topped out at about 845,000, higher than what was reported in February 2020. So they didn't give the total number. They just mentioned that it was 845,000 higher than the prior year. And these were people who had preferred full-time employment, who were working part-time because the hours had been reduced or they were unable to find full-time jobs. So these are people who are not lazy, who want to work, who have to work, all of these sorts of things. In context of that, we're seeing this, and I don't know if it's valid or not, but this that people are lazy and they don't want to work, and therefore we can't fill these open jobs, yet they're paying minimum wage largely, or less than a livable wage. So to me, I'm not an economist, but to me it looks like we have two competing narratives here, where the numbers bear out that people want to work and they want to work full time. So sure. In your mind, what's going on? What is the big picture here?
Yeah, the part that you missed, Carrie, a little bit ago was me explaining how the BLS calculates the unemployment statistics and the different categories of people that are actually excluded from the official statistics, like people who are excluded because they don't have adequate transportation, because the job doesn't pay enough and they can't take the job because they have an elderly parent or children to take care of home. So it makes more sense to stay home, stay out of the labor force. And one of those categories is this involuntary part-time workers category, or what the BLS calls people who are employed part-time for economic reasons. That's the category you're referring to. And those are individuals who are working a few hours. Even if you work 1 hour in the last 4 weeks, the last month, the BLS will put you in that category. So why do people work part-time for economic reasons? Because their employer doesn't have more hours for them, or their employer specifically gives them, the highest amount of hours right below the benchmark where they would have to start paying benefits for them. So think of companies like Walmart and low-paying jobs, essentially. So it's not because the workers don't want the job, it's because they don't have an employer to give them more hours. So this is very important to recognize that this is not workers choosing to work part-time because of personal reasons. So this is very, very specific. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you're saying this month the numbers in that category are 800,000 more than pre-COVID. Well, if I remember my numbers correctly, pre-COVID, under normal circumstances, that category usually have 2 to 3 million people. In the 2008, 2009 crisis, that category had almost 10 million people who were employed part-time. So what those numbers do, because they're counted as working, they're part of the labor force, they're not counted as unemployed. So the unemployment number would have been higher if we actually include the involuntary part-time workers. As a matter of fact, the BLS has an alternative statistic that they publish every month that's available to us to report on. But the media typically sticks with the headline unemployment statistics, the main number. But the BLS gives us a different statistics in which they include those who are officially unemployed based on the official definition, plus the involuntary part-time workers, this group that we're talking about, people who are employed part-time for economic reasons. But then they add those who are categorized as discouraged workers. And we can talk about who are the discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are people who are actively seeking work, which is the technical definition of unemployment, actively seeking work for months and months and months and couldn't find anything within, say, a 50-mile radius. In other words, they turned in job applications, they've done job interviews, they went to employment agencies, they've done their LinkedIn and all kinds of social media, resources to find a job. And they are in a position right now where they believe there's literally nothing left that they haven't applied for. They just give up. They're discouraged workers. And when they get the phone call from the BLS, the survey to see if they're in the labor force or not, they just say, we applied for everything. I'm kind of waiting for a company to call me back. I don't think there's anything available right now. Those are called discouraged. And the BLS classifies discouraged workers as not in the labor force because they're not actively seeking work anymore. So they're not counted as unemployed. They're not even in the labor force. But the BLS is pretty honest about this category, and they'll tell us how many people are in that category. They call them marginally attached to the labor force. They actually track this category, individuals in the category, for up to 12 months. Beyond 12 months, they don't consider you discouraged anymore. You just dropped out of the labor force. So that becomes kind of the long-term unemployment and beyond. But these are individuals who, if there's a job offer immediately, they'll take it, right? That's what they wanted to begin with, but they're not included. So in this alternative statistics that I mentioned, the BLS just takes these two categories, discouraged workers and involuntary part-time workers, which most people, common sense people say these are individuals that we should count as unemployed. And the BLS does give us the statistics, and it's usually almost double the official unemployment number. So this is the alternative measure. Just if we include these categories, let alone if we include people without transportation, people without adequate child care, people without adequate elderly care, people who lost employment because of a natural disaster, because they were on strike. All those categories are excluded from official unemployment statistics, right? So we could add up all these numbers, and then you get the millions of people who are sort of invisible in the statistics and invisible in the world of public policy. And that's why we argue for a job guarantee, because there are millions of people who want to participate if the system is flexible enough and pays decent wages and offers a network of services, including transportation, including childcare and elderly care. That's why we fight for a Green New Deal, because there are millions of people who want to participate, who have the skills, who have the desire to work, but it doesn't make any sense to work a job that doesn't pay you enough to take care of your kids, to take care of your elderly parents, or to provide decent transportation for you to get to the workplace or to take your kids to school or whatever. So that's why we need all of these transformative policies at once to raise the wage and benefits package so that we have more people doing what they want to do, which is work. All of these people want
and
to work.
eat.
Exactly.
And it's infuriating when you understand that because of Nauru, the government keeps a percentage of the population unemployed,
Sure.
right, in order to what they say, quote unquote, hedges against inflation, right?
Right.
And
So
these
millions
people,
of people are hijacked by this idea of natural unemployment and the threat of inflation, are literally hijacked in a hostage situation in order to, keep the scarecrow of, the threat of inflation at bay. And what MMT has done and continues to do is to call their bluff on this, to say there is no risk of inflation. Look at the massive spending that, countries like the US and Canada and the European Union, Japan, for is the best example. Decades literally of deflation and negative interest rates, despite massive quantitative easing and massive government deficits and the largest national debt in the world, 266% debt to GDP ratio at this point. But to go back to the focus question of the day, which is people saying we're not taking the $15, we're not taking jobs today because the government is paying $15 an hour unemployment benefit. This is just the tip of the iceberg for everything that I've been talking about here in terms of the millions of people who have been making the exact same decision for years, saying, why would I take, a job that pays minimum wage and then I can't afford childcare or elderly care or even transportation when I can stay home and at least have subsidized housing, have food stamp, whatever other social benefits are provided. So we need to engage in a conversation that tackles all of these issues at once, not just blame the low wage workers today for not taking jobs that are, poverty wages, paying poverty wages, instead of saying, well, we need to figure out how we pay people decent wages and provide them with benefits, because those individuals actually want to work in a safe work environment and with dignified workplace conditions and so on.
Okay, so I do want to get to the inflation question, because I'm starting to see that on Forbes and all of these as kind of the specter of the boogeyman coming. Yeah. But first, Amber posted a question, and this is going to require a little bit of speculation on your part, but let's go down this path. So Amber says, would our current national labor landscape be different if the federal government had just insured the payrolls of small businesses during COVID shutdown, like many other countries did?
Sure, and this is what many of us in the MMT and job guarantee community have advocated for from the beginning. So a job guarantee, or let me step back for a second. What we advocate for is universal public services that the federal government should provide: health, transportation, infrastructure, childcare, elderly care, you name it. Those are the universal services. The second layer.
To be clear, most other countries in the world already provide those services. So this is a very American-centric problem.
Sure. The second layer is a job guarantee for people who want to work. And then the third layer is a generous income support for people who can't work or should not work for health reasons and so on. So the job guarantee layer, a lot of people in the beginning of COVID said, well, see, we told you we can't have a job guarantee because people have to stay home. So we need basic income for everybody and nobody goes to work. Well, my argument was it's still a job guarantee because the most important job during the pandemic is to stay home. So nationalizing the payroll, the argument for nationalizing the payroll is essentially creating that safety net that captures everybody that's been displaced by the COVID crisis automatically, in order to do the most important job, which is to stay home, take care of their family, and help us, deal with the virus. And then for individuals who are able to work safely, either remotely, under a private sector employment, or a job guarantee remote work, or a socially distant job guarantee work environment, would be part of the job guarantee with paid decent wages and benefits instead of the system that we have now, which left millions of people underpaid, even with the government CARES Act payments. A lot of gig workers didn't get nearly enough what they would be making. So the short answer is, yeah, the landscape will be very different. We wouldn't have the stress and anxiety and the mounting debt that many people are accumulating, especially in terms of rent payments. The suspension of rent payments is going to come back with thousands of dollars owed in the next couple of months, literally, because we haven't canceled the rent payments. We just put a moratorium, and now this is coming back to haunt us. For even for individuals who kept their jobs, individuals who managed to get government support from the CARES Act. Now you have a year's worth of rent payment, and I don't know if you know anybody, working class or kind of middle class income bracket, who can point to several $1,000s in their savings account to pay rent in the middle of a pandemic. So we haven't dealt with this problem yet.
Thank you for bringing that up, because we did a segment a couple of weeks ago on Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and how the rent moratorium and mortgage moratorium works. It's not just that you're picking up your regular payment, but the principal on every month that you had that forbearance. That's a lot, especially when we have people making so much less. So Sherry, good morning. She wanted to reiterate your point, and she said there's never recognition of the fact that going to work alone is costly. And if people can't afford the costs associated with low paying jobs, it makes sense that they wouldn't take the job. So on the flip side, we're seeing big companies like Raytheon and Coca-Cola, these big multinationals who are like, hey, maybe we let people work from home now because it saved us a ton of money. And they're scaling back their real estate. But we kind of see this ebb and flow just about every 10 years where there's an expansion of work at home, and then a contraction again where they want to bring people back. So let's look forward and kind of, again, I'm going to put you on the spot with speculating on what the jobs are going to look like. To me, I'm encouraged by what's happening because it gives more power to the workers. In if you look throughout history, every time there's a pandemic, it always goes back to power for the workers, negotiating power and changing what we define as work and how we work. Is that what we're seeing, or am I being too optimistic here?
There is an opportunity, but in order for this opportunity to materialize, we have to organize. You have to have a clear vision and an organized movement to push for new regulations, for higher wages and benefits. But I'll start with a quick comment on Sherry's question, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the categories of people who are excluded from the unemployment statistics includes people who are excluded because of lack of adequate transportation. And that number, I haven't looked at it recently, is usually around 3 million people, mostly in the Midwest and rural areas. So this brings us to the question of remote work and the transformation of the workplace after COVID. Yes, quite a bit of remote work will happen, but it will be mostly for people who are higher paid, who can do kind of engineering, technical, and type of work, office work that can be done remotely. Teaching, probably not, because with the experience that we've seen, there's going to be still quite a bit of online kind of instruction and teaching and tutorials, but people are dying for going back to the higher quality interaction which you have in the classroom. So that I don't think will go away, but will be supplemented with new tools and online resources and things like that, which is good. But then that leaves workers who can't actually do their work remotely, right? And so those workers will go back to work, hopefully after this virus situation is under control. But for people who will be excluded from the higher paid work that will be done remotely increasingly, especially in rural areas, it's not just the lack of transportation. So now you can work from home. You don't have to have transportation. But if you don't have broadband infrastructure, if you don't have access to childcare, you're going to have your kids running in the background, like my kids do, then then those individuals will still be excluded. So that's why one of the big asks for the infrastructure plan, and I'm part of a Reimagine Appalachia effort in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. One of the core demands is a broadband infrastructure investment in the area, not just for people to do work remotely, but for students to get online and to have access to information. For telehealth, telemedicine is increasingly a thing now, even pre-COVID. There's a lot of telehealth happening. Lots of rural hospitals don't have specialists and need telehealth infrastructure to communicate with larger hospitals nationally or in the big cities in their states. And it just doesn't make sense. If we know for sure that the jobs of the future will be in the digital economy and artificial intelligence and coding, and we're systematically excluding millions of people in rural areas from having access to that highway that gets them to the digital economy, which is broadband infrastructure. So it's a no-brainer that we need at least this basic infrastructure, in addition to transportation, which doesn't mean we should give up on transportation. But if we're going towards more digital, tech-based, robotics-based jobs for learning, for health, for telecommunication, and we're excluding millions of people, then we shouldn't be surprised in 10 or 20 years to see more of the problems that we're dealing with today actually in rural areas and areas that have been neglected from an infrastructure standpoint. So these are the things that we need to organize for, not just move to digital infrastructure and still be underpaid, right? That doesn't help either.
True. So you brought up a subject that's very near and dear to me in my own frustration, because now I went from a major metropolitan city to a remote area, and I have been fighting with private for-profit companies who can make a small adjustment and choose not to because the profitability is not there. They don't care. Yeah. But, in my little valley alone, there's 56,000 families who don't have internet at all. Sure. Because these for-profit companies haven't done it. So to me, it goes back to the same kind of libertarian argument that companies will finance the building of roads so their employees can get there. And we know that's not the case. So
not at all. What you're facing is not an accident. It was designed this way. The big internet service provider, telecom companies that are supposed to compete in the private sector, to compete for customers like you and I, and to provide the best price, the best quality, the best service. And they're supposed to put the infrastructure to deliver that competitive product. They met a long time ago and decided, you know what, this competition thing is not good for us because we'll end up spending a lot of money. So let's take the map of the United States, divide it into little territories. You take that, I take this, you take that, and we don't have to compete. This way, you're your little mini monopoly in that particular valley, and you charge whatever you think your customers will pay. And if it's really too expensive to even provide the service, you don't even have to provide the service to those 50,000 families. They can, move somewhere else or whatever. So what we're talking about here is abusive price-setting behavior and monopoly-like conditions that should be tackled by the federal government and only by the federal government. Can't be tackled by a city, can't be tackled because this is like a public utility. Just like the highway system, just like the water and electricity and resources that all of us consume are regulated like public utilities. Telecommunication and especially internet access in this digital economy, increasingly digital economy, has to be regulated as a public utility. And if the private sector is not going to put the infrastructure in place, the federal government has responsibility to provide this public service.
It totally makes sense to me because on the flip side of this, when you talk about transportation and all of these marginalized people, we also have this great swath of the country, disabled and other people who cannot access limited transportation, rely on the internet. I got a call from Social Security saying, hey, we would like you to return to work. I'm like, great, me too. How? I don't have the means to do that. Help me get there. And even they were stumped. So we have not just seen through COVID that we have a lack of infrastructure to help people get back to work who are able-bodied at least, but then also the disabled veterans who've come back, the people who have mobility issues, other disabilities. Those people have always been there and not getting the same services. So is this part of the consideration on redefining work and how things should move forward?
Right. So part of redefining work is to think about the entire support system that goes with a job. So even those of us in the job guarantee, the earlier literature was sort of naive about this question, because the assumption was, well, you pay people a decent wage and benefits, and they'll take the job. But from my perspective and the things that I learned over the last few years, kind of working with individuals and communities who have deeper structural problems than just the lack of employment, you realize that if you offer me the job and I can't show up at 9 a.m. because I'm dealing with an addiction, or I'm dealing with mental health issues, or I'm dealing with all kinds of social and economic problems that have been fermented for decades because of the neglect that we see, especially in rural areas, then you're literally setting me up to fail. If you're telling me to show up at 9 and I have no transportation, even though you're paying me $15 an hour with benefits, well, those benefits don't include public transportation. Those benefits don't include childcare or elderly care or care for a family member who's struggling with addiction or struggling with mental health issues. So what I've shifted my perspective on what the job guarantee, and especially what the Green New Deal needs to provide, is not just the job with the standard benefits and decent wages. We have to create the entire ecosystem that allows people to thrive on the job. In other words, you have to be able to support individuals with mental health assistance, physical health, which is why we argue for Medicare for all, support in terms of housing, access to housing, because a lot of veterans are excluded from housing because they have been arrested for something that they've done related to their addiction or mental health issues. So it's a trap where people fall into a system of a vicious cycle that systematically excludes them from private sector, government sector, any benefits. So we have to undo all of these structural traps, and there's no way to undo this if we just rely on the market or on charity to provide services for the elderly or for veterans or for individuals who are struggling with addiction or mental health issues. This is part of that first layer that I described earlier, which is universal public services that include housing and health, including mental health, transportation, and so on. That's how we begin to tackle this. And if we do this systematically in a sustained way for, let's say, a decade, where we start to see an impact, I guarantee you that we're going to start resolving so many additional social issues, and the costs associated, the hidden costs associated with what I call the cost of doing nothing, right? That's why I always say the cost of doing the right thing is way, way lower than the cost of the status quo, the cost of doing nothing. So even from a fiscally conservative standpoint, we should be arguing for the cheaper version, which is doing the right thing, putting the right investments in place, as opposed to dealing with the negative consequences of inaction. I'll give you just one example. The cost of the opioid crisis in the US, and there's a recent study published by, well, not so recent anymore, but a study published by the White House, by the team of economic advisors, that estimated that the cost of the opioid crisis in a 4-year period where they did the study was $4 trillion. That's the cost of inaction. That's the cost of not solving the problem, just dealing with the negative consequences. One of my colleagues did a recent study in one county in West Virginia, one of the highest impacted counties, and she estimated that the cost for that one county, relatively small population in West Virginia, was $1.6 billion a year. That's the cost of doing nothing. It's just dealing with the negative consequences. And when you add the additional layers associated with the cost of inaction on so many fronts, including not dealing with the pollution, right? We end up paying hundreds of billions of dollars in healthcare treatment and lost productivity and lost school performance for kids because of breathing conditions, because of illnesses they get from drinking polluted water and breathing polluted air and eating polluted food. That's the cost of doing nothing, right? Investing in clean air, clean soil, clean water eliminates all those costs and gives us healthier people, creates the jobs for the infrastructure that we need to build, and helps us heal as a nation from a public health perspective. So because we focus on narrow kind of time frames and decisions, we think, oh, it's too expensive to clean the water source. It's too expensive to invest in renewable energy. Instead, we keep the status quo and we pay for it many times over in the long term with as I often say, with money, blood and tears, right? Because it's not just the money, it's the economic and social pain and the public health pain that all of us suffer from. So it's just broadening our perspective. Yeah, right. Broadening our perspective. Even if you're a fiscally conservative person, nobody wants to pay for the health effects. Wouldn't you rather pay for after school programs and job creation programs, or not do that and then force teenagers into the prison industrial complex and pay $60,000 a piece per year, right? When you can pay less to send them to Harvard, to send them to the best schools in the country, to produce engineers and technicians and lawyers and doctors to serve their own communities. It just doesn't add up.
So it's actually a hidden tax on the back end for the individual, and then this false myth of competition. If this kid gets to go to Harvard, then my little Johnny can't possibly go, and we need to get outside that thinking. But before we end here, and real quick, thank you. Sherry has posted some links to the work that she has done on research and history for antitrust regulations. So she was tying into what you were saying about a monopoly. Sure. So thank you, Sherry. Then I need to get to inflation, because that I have seen Janet Yellen and all these investment publications coming out with inflation. What's going on that front? Is that when they raise interest rates, what are they actually doing? And should I, as an individual, I'm not a capitalist, so should I be worried about inflation? What does it mean?
Sure. So inflation is when the average price level goes up month to month, year to year. Deflation is the opposite, when the average price level goes down, month to month, year to year. And we talked about the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, earlier, which is the agency that produces the unemployment statistics for us. They also produce the inflation statistics for us. And it's actually worth spending a minute, if we have a minute, just to talk about how they do it. So they look at the average American family, not too rich, not too poor, and they look at the average consumption basket. What do we consume? We buy milk and butter and clothing and transportation and all the things. And they don't price like the most expensive, milk carton or the most expensive. They take the average milk price, the average sugar price, the average price of everything, and then they weigh each item based on its importance. Of course, bubble gums are not as important in our budget, so it's not worth mentioning. But milk and bread and things like that, and of course the bigger items, transportation and clothing and so on, will get weighed a little heavier. And they construct sort of a weighted average, and that becomes the inflation index that they call the consumer price index. And when that index moves up month to month, that's called inflation. And when that index moves down, that's called deflation. And when we talk about inflation, we usually talk about the annual change from year to year. We don't really care about the month to month because it's too short of a time frame and there's seasonal effects and things like that. So that's inflation. But then when you look at that consumer basket, it has category by category, certain categories that are inflating quite a bit, and certain categories that are actually deflating. And the average shows whatever the inflation rate is. So it's the MMT community, and especially heterodox economists, have been telling us for decades now that don't pay too much attention to the average CPI inflation index, pay attention to the categories. And when you pay attention to the categories, you start to think about two things. One is the pricing power or the market power of industries in that category, because that could drive inflation for that category. And the second thing is the productive capacity of the economy to meet the additional demand for milk and sugar and housing and clothing and all that. So the more productive capacity we have, the less inflationary pressure we have in that category. The more pricing power an industry has, like your internet service provider who raised their prices every other month and there's nothing you can do about it, the more inflation pressure you get in that category. The thing with the COVID crisis right now is that it adds another layer of complexity to this that you see discussed in the media a little bit, which is the supply chain bottlenecks and the substantial increase in demand in particular categories like lumber or demand for raw materials to make microchips and things like that. The big question for all of us to consider is the following. Is this increase in demand in these categories temporary, transitory, or is it permanent? And I'm leaning more on it being transitory, just because of the immediate rush for this. But it also has something to do with the productive capacity side. So, for example, for lumber, it's not like we ran out of trees all of a sudden, right? But what we ran out of is capital equipment to process those trees into lumber for construction, for furniture, and so on. So the main capitalist in this particular industry, they have two choices. The first choice is to build up more productive capacity so that they can process more trees to provide the lumber for consumers today. But then they're looking at it in this way. They're saying, well, if this is just a temporary boost in demand, why would I spend millions of dollars buying more capital equipment that's going to remain idle later on? Why would I have all of that excess capacity? When my second choice is not to spend millions of dollars, jack up the prices during this crisis, and consumers are willing to pay for it anyway. So which one do you think I'm going to go for? I'm going to jack up the prices and enjoy the ride, right? Of course, they're increasing a little bit of the capacity. They're buying a little bit more sawmills. So you see actually a shortage of sawmills from the manufacturing side for sawmills, but not to the point where you would flood the market with cheaper lumber, because you have no incentive to do that, right? So we're experiencing this quite a bit actually in these categories. So my focus on this is that always look at what is the root cause of the inflation pressure. And this is what MMTers typically do, what post-Keynesians and institutional economists, heterodox economists do. Now, I'll tell you about the mainstream economists, what they're saying. They're stuck in their textbook model, which says the more government deficit, the more government spending you have, the more inflation. And now what are they saying? Aha, we told you so. All of that CARES money, all that big spending is really kicking in because they believe that consumers now are, have a massive amount of cash and they're going on a shopping spree to buy furniture, to buy houses, to buy whatever they want. So they're blaming the inflationary pressure on too much purchasing power from consumers, from workers. And this feeds, by the way, a little bit to the $15, wage boost, because those are the source of inflation all of a sudden, right? Not market power or shortage of productive capacity and so on. So from their perspective, this is why they call for reducing government spending, reducing government subsidies, reducing the $15 unemployment benefits, or eliminating it altogether so that people go back to work at lower wages and so on. I'll give you one kind of thing to think about. So the classic mainstream approach to fighting inflation from a central bank perspective, because that's their mandate, is to eventually raise interest rates, because they believe raising interest rates will slow down the lending, will slow down the spending, right? The consumer borrowing and spending, and that will slow down demand. Now tell me, how does raising the interest rate in the US fix the inflation pressure point from shortage of microchips? How does raising the interest rate today fix the inflation pressure from higher energy prices because OPEC raised their prices, right? It has nothing to do with it. So most of the time, the inflation that we experience is a supply side inflation, whereas the central bank raising interest rate is trying to deal with a demand side inflation, consumers having too much purchasing power. So they're aiming at the wrong problem. The problem is way outside their jurisdiction. The problem can be addressed. Guess by who? By Congress, by applying antitrust laws, by investing or incentivizing additional productive capacity in strategic areas that will provide the economy with the key resources that we need. In developing countries, it's actually worse than the US, because developing countries rely on food imports and energy imports. Those prices are controlled by, if you're importing wheat, it's controlled by the US, Russia, the Ukraine, and so on. How does raising your interest rate as a developing country convince the Ukraine and Russia to lower wheat prices? It's got nothing to do with it. How does raising your interest rate convince OPEC or Saudi Arabia to lower oil prices? It has nothing to do with it. So you're hurting your economy by making the cost of doing business even more expensive for your economy because you're raising the interest rate, and you haven't addressed the source of inflation, which is way outside of your jurisdiction, in this case, way outside your country's jurisdiction. So that's what the MMT approach to inflation tells us: focus on the actual inflation pressure point and design policies. Those policies typically are in the hands of Congress or the parliament to address the source of inflation.
I'm so thrilled that you brought that up, because we're actually seeing some of this antitrust thing. And I know Sherry Wise over there is screaming and yelling at her PC, yes, antitrust. Because one of the stories that we focused on was we had Joe, and I keep bringing it up because this is developing really quickly. Joe had a problem with coverage in healthcare, and now we're seeing across the board Blue Cross Blue Shield and now Aetna and other states are starting to bring antitrust legislation against healthcare industries.
Sure.
So I'm encouraged by that people are pressuring their local state representatives and in some cases even Congress to use that power of antitrust for free market competition or whatever have you, to get that price point down and get the coverage of services. So we're not talking about total nationalization, but at least, use the laws that we have on the books for the purpose of inflation. So now, me as just a regular person,
when a lot of people say, we're fighting for a more democratic society and taking money out of politics, this is really what we should be focused on. Because those lawmakers who have the power and the authority to regulate and to enforce antitrust laws, if they're brought to you by super PACs funded by those same companies in the health insurance industry or the telecom industry, why would they bite the hands that feed them? Right? So we really need to be very clear about why we're calling for more people-funded candidates and why we need to push our elected officials on the transparency front, on the democratic front, so that they actually do the work that a democracy is supposed to do, which is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not of the super PACs, by big oil, by big pharma, for big Wall Street.
It makes sense to me. I don't know why we have to keep explaining this. So Andy, we're almost out of time, and I know that we could talk on this subject forever, which is why we definitely need to have you back for the next segment. But Andy, did I miss anything for today?
I'm not sure, because I've spent the last 20 minutes trying to reboot my computer.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh boy. See, it's the tech issues. So publicly funded media, folks, that is who we are. We are not influenced by businesses or anybody who wants publicly funding. If you'd like to donate $1, help Andy's computer. So
Yes, we are not encumbered by electricity in any way.
right.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Like
it's
my new computer is on its way. Just so you know, Friday should be all better.
all better. So this is good. But Fadhel, thank you so much for joining us, because you just do an excellent job in explaining it. And even like Sherry and Amber, everybody's cheering that your succinct explanation on inflation, because for those of us who are not in this kind of space, it's like, okay, what's coming next? What new hell do I have to deal with on top of everything else? So I really appreciate that. Is any last thoughts that you want to leave us with until your next time, things that we should be looking at, or one thing you think people should maybe go and read or research? What homework should we have? Oh, you're muted.
Yep.
There you go.
Thanks again for the opportunity to be here and to discuss these issues. I think the main homework is stay vigilant, stay alert, and really pay attention to what elected officials are doing, and especially pay attention to what they're not doing, and call them, call them and pressure them to do the right thing. And if they don't, then unseat them. One at a time if we have to, and stay informed, stay engaged with this network, with many of the progressive networks that are providing really valuable public information, deep dive analysis, and accessible information about what is this thing about inflation, what is this thing about unemployment, and kind of providing an alternative narrative that supports the progressive vision, supports really a democratic vision that is equitable and just for people in this country and beyond. And this way, when you're pushing back against the establishment in politics and the economics profession, they can't tell you you don't know what you're talking about. Because now you can call their bluff on what is inflation, what is the source of inflation. You can call their bluff on their claims that people are lazy and don't want to work. You can call their bluff on whatever issue comes up, on climate change, on jobs, on politics, on transparency, and things like that. So the better informed we are, the better informed pitchforks we have, the more successful we'll be in making this world a better place.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. And we're now going to use that as a promo. So I appreciate it. So
thank you.
So that is all I have. And thank you again to Dr. Kaboub. Andy, you want to take us out? Final thoughts or prayers for your...
My final thought is thanks, Fadhel, for coming by. I'm going back to bed.
All right.
Hope you get well soon.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I'm building up antibodies, and that makes this all worthwhile. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we will see you here, hopefully bright and early Friday, with new equipment that doesn't shut off on its own. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
We bout that, ayy. We in the zone. We out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keep it ninja.